Hey there, everybody. This is Brandon Muth with Muthonomics. This is a special episode of Muthonomics. I want to talk today about something that is near and dear to my heart, um, namely poverty. And you might look at that or hear that and kind of chuckle and say, "What?" Because I have run into that a lot throughout my life. People see, um, they might look at pictures of me and say, "Wait, there's no way that you experienced poverty." Um, and one of the reasons that I am deciding to do this special episode is, the more I look around at social media, there's almost an irresistible urge to present to the world a perfectly crafted image showing how successful you are. And while I guess that's fine and dandy, and a handful of people are able to perfect conveying that manufactured, sometimes fake image in order to make a living off of it, whether it's through YouTube views or sponsored posts on Instagram. The hard reality is that there are millions of people, not only in America but obviously around the rest of the world, who are nowhere near uh, being able to communicate or attain that type of lifestyle. And I think that that leaves a huge uh, swath or gap of people that are experiencing a tremendous disconnect between what they see on social media as being the norm or the goal for life and what they are actually experiencing. And having grown up uh, extremely poor in America, and having grown up with an extremely unorthodox childhood, um, and then wrestling through the consequences, the expected consequences and ramifications of growing up in those circumstances, I think there are some things that I've thought through quite deeply that I think I'm hopeful will be beneficial to the rest of everyone else. As Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. I mean, the rest of us. I think there needs to be an encouraging message to the rest of us, um, because the social media elites are living comfortably and increasing their fame and fortune by conveying a lifestyle that is really, as I said, disconnected and unattainable for the rest of us. And I don't even think, you know, we set that up as our goal. Like, oh, I need to do things in order to mirror this lifestyle that I'm seeing on my feeds, and we're not given the tools or the mindset or anything really to even begin to break out of where we are in order to begin to take productive, proactive steps towards change. And from the outset, I want to say that the end goal here is not to, this is not a get rich quick scheme. This is not some 5 tips on how you too can live like Kim Kardashian or Kanye West or something. I mean, I think that end goal, I'll say from the very outset that that goal is wrong. That's not the goal that we should be striving for. We should not be striving for fame and elitism and just this out of touch with reality approach to how we define success. Um, so I'll say that the goal here is not that. The goal here is to take steps away from um, poverty and take steps towards being a productive, functioning, contented, happy member of society. So, um, with that said, there's 5 things that I've gleaned. I'll be turning 40 this year in about a month, and as I said, that my 20s and 30s, it was bumpy dealing with processing a lot of the ramifications of growing up poor. Now you say, "Come on, Brandon, there's no way you grew up that poor." For those of you who know me, for those of you who may already follow Muthonomics to some extent, forgive me for being redundant here, but I grew up in a very vagabondy, kind of hippie, off the grid childhood. We moved 17 times by the time I was 12. Uh, most of that, most of those years were spent in a very transient lifestyle. My dad had a small trailer that he put on the back of his 58 Dodge pickup, and we bounced around different locations in Colorado and Arizona. Um, when things got even worse economically, we downgraded to a camper shell on the back of my dad's 58 Dodge, and we bounced around New Mexico and parts of Arizona, um, living in RV stops and truck stops and uh, public campgrounds and things. And then when we finally did settle, I use those words very loosely, it was on a very isolated plot of land in northern New Mexico, uh, in a beat up, drafty piece of crap trailer that was miles from any modern amenities. So we had no plumbing, we had no indoor running water, we had no electricity. Um, so for lights at night, we would burn kerosene lamps. Our toilet system was a Coleman porta potty that would fill up quite frequently, and we'd have to carry it out and either put it in the trunk of the car and go empty it at a gas station where they had RV amenities. Um, Sometimes we would just carry it out into the wilderness and just dump it, because there was nobody around us. We were so far away from everybody. We hauled water in 55-gallon drums, and we would take basin baths. My mom would bring home these plastic urinals from the hospital where she worked, and we would heat up water um, through the propane stove and pour them into basins and take little kind of sponge baths with a couple gallons of water. Um, there were times when we went uh, hungry. I mean, I remember one time it was so bad that we didn't know where our next meal was coming from. So we ended up going, and my dad dropped us off out in the middle of even more nowhere along this rural New Mexican highway, and gave me and my mom and my sisters plastic bags and said, "Hey, scour along the highways and pick up aluminum cans." And we did that for several hours, and were able to get enough to take it into Albuquerque and sell it by the pound at a recycling center, and went and got some, as I've said many times, some off-brand mac and cheese money, and I'm sure some beer from my old man. Um, there was another time I remember we were so desperate for food that an older couple who somehow knew my dad when he was younger, he found out that we were in Albuquerque in our camper, and they coordinated somehow with them, and they showed up in their car, and they opened the trunk, and there was a trunk full of Costco food. And that was like hitting the jackpot for me as a 9-year old. And to this day, I still love powdered mashed potatoes as a result of that. So that's just a little bit of a story of my upbringing. Um, and it's not to say, oh, woe is me. Look, I grew up poor. Oh, I want sympathy. It's really to kind of just be honest with how I grew up, and to communicate that, that's pretty bad American poverty. And the things that impacted me from that, and the title of this talk is Overcoming the Perils of Poverty. As I've processed those experiences over the last 20 years or so, there have been repeatedly 5 things that have jumped out at me, which constitute the perils of poverty. And we'll just go through them one at a time here. And the first is obviously isolation, a big fat isolation, and living out in the middle of nowhere, with just empty acreage all around you. um, it has a very isolating effect. And as I've made friends, in my adulthood, and I've met people who have grown up in poverty that was more urban, more in the city. Even though they're around people, there's still this sense of isolation. And I think that's the first peril that poverty does is it creates this atmosphere of being isolated. And that can be it can create a lot of loneliness, um, because you're not engaging with people. Either you don't have the funds to go engage with people, you don't have the money to go, to movies with friends, you don't have the money to go on vacations and talk about them with friends. You really are just out there surviving. And I think being out in the middle of nowhere made it kind of compounds it, because you're not you don't even have a shared experience with, say, people who might be in an inner city, or someone around where you're close to people. You really just have this sense of, wow, I am the only person in the world that is experiencing this. I'm the only person in the world that's taking sponge baths out of a urinal from the hospital. Um, and it really has an impact on your mentality. Um, so I think the first peril that poverty creates is one of isolation. And if you're anywhere, if you're in poverty, or you've been in poverty, you know that that's true. And it's the first peril that I think poverty creates. That quickly leads to the second peril, which is despair. When you begin to survey your surroundings, and especially as a kid, it's not like as a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old you can say, hey, screw this, I'm going to go get a job, and change my stars, so to speak. As a kid, you really either just sort of have to learn how to cope with it, through a wild imagination, which I think is probably, I contribute my current creativity to having to come up with various mental frames in order to sort of escape the realities of the lifestyle that we were living in on a daily basis. Um, I've talked about in over at my website, lessons learned from uh, draining urine. You know, and that's a whole nother discussion. But if you head over to my website, I've got a whole discussion about you know coming up with frames to sort of find positive ways to interact through really atrocious circumstances. Uh, but even in the midst of now being able to contribute my creativity to some of those bad experiences as a kid, the despair is so palpable, because you feel like you're never going to get out of it. It feels like you're up to your waist in quicksand, and every day that passes, you're continuing to sink a quarter inch. And before you know it, it feels like you're up to your armpits in quicksand and you're about to drown. Um, and the isolation creating the despair, I mean, these are very heavy, very burdensome things to try to overcome. And it's something that really bothers me now. Even though I'm a huge believer in free markets and a huge believer in creativity and a huge believer in entrepreneurship, the the privileged, sort of fake entrepreneurialism that a lot of these wealthy, country club boy, frat boy, uh, policy people and politicians and things, these business people who, talk about, oh, the merits of the free market. And then you find out that, their dad was loaded and their uncle was the chairman of this and and you go, okay, that it's just so callous and so out of touch. Like, don't talk to me about your country club struggles. That, oh yeah, I really had to pull myself up by my bootstraps when I started my company. Even though my dad and grandfather were sitting on millions of dollars and they would have bailed me out anyway. Um, so even though I'm a huge believer in free markets, I'm a huge believer in entrepreneurship, I find the voices of those particular movements today to be a little disingenuous because they are coming from a spot of extreme privilege already. So anyway, that's just a side note. But um, the despair is heavy, and if you're in poverty, if you have grown up poor, you are currently poor. You, for me to say that it's palpable, that you can feel it, the weight on your shoulders and the weight, the fogginess in your mind as a result of being isolated, and then this despair that sets in that says, I'm never going to be able to change these circumstances as a kid, is a very, very difficult thing that has long lasting effects. Um, the third thing that I've noticed that comes out of this extreme poverty, you have the isolation, which leads to the despair, and I think the first knee-jerk reaction to that is grumbling, a lot of complaining. I mean, I remember growing up, and anybody who had any sense or any sign of any sort of normalcy, my dad just instantly complained about them, instantly cursed them out. Had all kinds of choice profanities to describe them. And that quickly spilled over onto me. And especially in my 20s, it was very difficult for me to not instantly have a knee jerk negative reaction towards people who were successful. There's just so much grumbling that gets embedded in your heart through the environment of the isolation and the despair, that any positivity around you, instead of rejoicing with them or seeing that as, wow, that's a result of them taking practical steps to move towards the goals they've set. Instead, you just grumble about it. And I think, from there, in that position, when you're in that position of isolated despair and grumbling, you view success as sort of being like winning the lottery. Your faculties and your mental capabilities and your emotional maturity to recognize that success is typically the byproduct of setting goals, having discipline, sticking to a schedule, not being addicted to substances, and adhering to a routine. Like in that isolated, despair laden, grumbling state, you don't see those logical connections, and success feels like it's a crapshoot. Even worse than a crapshoot. I mean, crapshoot, what you've got, you know, 6 possibilities with dice, maybe 1 out of 12 if you're playing, two dice. My probability is probably off there, but you get the idea. It feels more like winning the Powerball, like a 1 in 282 million chance. And so you see a doctor, or you see an accountant, or you see a manager at Sam's Club or whatever, and you just grumble and get mad and angry, and you go, "Oh yeah, they're so lucky." No, they're not. They're not lucky. They were pragmatic. They were practical, and that's something that you get blinded to that, as a result of being isolated, falling into despair, and then grumbling at anybody who shows any sort of normalcy. The fourth thing is then, I think, apathy. I noticed this a lot with my old man. You know, those first 3 things of the isolation, the despair, and the grumbling has a tendency to create apathy in you, like whatever. A laziness, like, well, I'm not going to win the lottery, so I might as well just continue to eke out a living. And so everything becomes very much just survival mode. There's no goals of moving beyond survival mode. Everything becomes, how do I hack this current system just to continue to survive? And so, it becomes extreme examples of living paycheck to paycheck, extreme examples of living hand to mouth, so to speak. And, looking back, my dad put together quite the extravagant plan, which even to this day, trying to figure out how it all worked, I don't really know. But I do remember incredibly frequent trips to the pawn shop, where he would. We kind of had a cycle set up where he would go to yard sales and flea markets and things, and try to score really good deals on tools, and then we had a continuous uh, cycle of visits to a particular pawn shop where then he would either turn around and sell those tools for a markup, or pawn them. And then the thing that I can't figure out now is when he did pawn them, he somehow always came up with additional money to go back and unpawn them at some point. And that I never really understood how he did that. He also had an elaborate scheme where he spent a lot of energy. Back in the day, I remember he could write a check at this particular grocery store. He could write a check for $100 over the amount. And I'm not even sure if you can do that anymore. It's probably similar to getting cash back now with your debit card. But I remember he would go into a store and he would get, he'd buy a case of beer for $8, $9, whatever it was. It might have been even less than that back in the 80s and 90s. It might have been $6 or $7. I can't really remember. But he would go in, he'd buy an item, and then he would, so let's say that the case of beer was $7. He would write a check for $107, and then they would give him $100 back. And then he would take that $100 and he'd go to the pawn shop, and he would cover various obligations that he had that were juggling up in the air. And then there was always this immense pressure within the next 2 days to go deposit $100, $107 back into the bank account so that check didn't bounce. And I'm not too sure how we pulled that off. It seems like there might have been some Western Union transfers from my grandma at times. I know there was a steady stream of student loans, because it took him 30 years to graduate college. But my point in saying all of that is the extreme survival mode that you get into. Instead of proactively taking steps to, okay, how do I live within my means? How do I not be addicted to substances? How do I set goals and consistently and patiently move towards those? It became this wild fiasco, this massive sort of modern day Gizmodo hack job of how to eke out a living, keep mac and cheese on the table while continuing to purchase copious amounts of cheap beer. And all the energy was spent there. All of the energy was spent on just keeping that house of cards up. All the energy was spent on simply keeping those plates spinning. And I remember every now and then they would come crashing down and he wouldn't make it to the bank in time to cover the $100 over check, and it would bounce, and then you get hit with an overdraft fee, and that would fly him into some irrational rage. So it's very it ultimately becomes very counterproductive, and it becomes very self-defeating, because in trying to survive in a way that is so short-sighted, you just get in a cycle where you really can't get out of it. It is like you're circling the toilet bowl perpetually. Like, it would almost be a mercy and a relief to actually just go down the toilet and end up in the sewer. Like the crash and burn moment. It would actually be a relief. But to live in that perpetual toilet bowl cycle of, it creates so much stress on your system, so much anxiety, so much adrenaline rushes. And I look back on those days, even as a 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old, and I loathe those experiences. I remember just always being on edge because that stress and that anxiety and that panic, for really no reason, is just, it's just there, and it's perpetual, and it's inescapable. And as I've said, I've befriended adults who have grown up more in non-rural poverty, and that same sentiment. We've talked at length about the payday loan system, probably very similar to my dad's writing checks for over the thing. You're always borrowing from tomorrow in order to meet the needs and demands of today. And I've talked to friends who have grown up in that system, and the levels of I say it like this: it feels like your nerves are on battery acid. It feels like your brain and your nervous system was raised on battery acid, and that is difficult. That has long-lasting effects. How you view the world, how you view your current course, and to kind of encapsulate all of that, after I left, moved out as soon as I was 18, moved away from that environment and tried to take steps towards, more normalcy. Um, One of the signs that was still lingering was, 4 years after moving out of the house, I ended up enrolling in college, and I was married, just had gotten married, and I remember coming home. I was taking classes. I was enrolled full time, maybe taking 15 or 18 hours this semester. And I remember walking home, and I told my wife. I got home to the apartment, and I looked at her, and I said, if I just continue to do this for the next 3.5 years, I'll get my diploma. I'll get my college degree. Like, it was like eureka moment for me. Like, I couldn't believe it. And she looked at me like I was the dumbest person on the face of the earth. She was like, yeah, I mean, obviously. But in an environment where you grow up where there's never any goals set and there's never any consistent pursuit of those goals, everything is viewed as you're borrowing from tomorrow to survive today. And any sort of success that you have is purely chance, and it's the equivalent of winning the Powerball. So these are difficult things, and as you turn into adulthood, to sort of unwire, to not only unwire but then rewire these habits and tendencies and learned behaviors in a way that don't self-sabotage, and do that in a way where you cease borrowing from tomorrow to survive today, and you actually begin to try to be patient, be consistent, be diligent. Very, very, very difficult. And I really do think that, going back to the very beginning of this, the social media stars, they're doing people in these situations such a tremendous disservice, because they're making the leap from where they are to being famous and successful seem easy. And it's why I think you have so many stupid stunts being done on social media, because instead of young people being told, hey, you need to take some consistent, deliberate, diligent steps towards changing your life, they just say, oh, well, if I pour alcohol on myself and light myself on fire, then I'll instantly be famous and I'll start having sponsors. Or if I do some stupid challenge, hey, girlfriend, shoot me with this gun through this book and we'll go viral and we'll be famous and we'll have, ad money. And, these are stories that are actually happening, and people are getting killed as a result of this. I think it is very much the correlation between the poverty mentality equating success with being a crapshoot, which very much fits the modern narrative of going viral. And it's overnight success, and it's so damaging. So if you're a young person, if you're a teenager, if you're 20 something, even if you're 30 something, or maybe even older, maybe you're older, and you have grown up in poverty and you've adopted these mentalities, it's so vital that you realize that these perils of poverty are very much in your life, and you need to come up with some proactive, diligent strategies to overcome them, and not just continue to borrow from tomorrow to try to survive today. So we've got isolation, which leads to despair, which creates tremendous amounts of grumbling anytime we look around at others that are showing any signs of normalcy and success, which leads to apathy, which I'm defining as, not putting together a consistent plan and being diligent to pursue that plan, but simply scrambling and getting comfortable with just trying to survive today. And the fifth thing that I noticed that all these four things kind of culminate in is fatalism. And it's very closely related to apathy, but the fatalism takes it one step farther and sort of puts some kind of divine layer on top of it and says, well, this is what fate has for me. This is what God intends for me. So screw everything, and I'm just going to not care anymore. And once you reach that stage, I actually think that it's where you can then kind of rebound from. I'm not saying you have to reach the fatalistic stage, but it's sort of like, whatever the levels of grief are. I mean, you sort of almost have to kind of go through each one of these phases and experience each one of these things very personally and deeply, in order to kind of reset on how you're going to move forward. And the fatalism is a tricky one, because I've seen it completely hamstring people and completely incapacitate them. But I've also seen there's a real sense of there's a real dose of reality that happens when you hit the fatalism zone. And that dose of reality has a real powerful effect to say, hey, you know what, these previous things, yes, they've happened. Yes, I've experienced them, but I don't need to continue to persist in them. And I'm not too sure how many of you are actually paying attention, but I did this on quite deliberately, worded these with the isolation, despair, grumbling, apathy, and fatalism, because it is IDGAF. And without actually saying what that means, that's a pretty common abbreviation these days. IDGAF. I don't give a, and you can insert the word that you want there. So I think these are the perils of poverty, is it creates a IDGAF mentality. And what anybody in poverty needs to know, whether you're in America, in the inner city, isolated somewhere out in the country, whether you're in some third world country listening to this, what you need to know is the IDGAF, they're real. Those things are real. The temptations are real. The experiences are real. We go through them. They're palpable. They're powerful, but they can be overcome. And the first step to overcoming them is recognizing that they're there, not making excuses for them, and then figuring out, okay, now, in order to move away from this, it's the opposite of these things. There needs to be goals set. There needs to be perseverance, being deliberate, being diligent, no longer equating success with a lottery draw. So there's counterparts to each one of these five, and I'll talk about those in another special Muthonomics episode. But I did want to get this off my chest and out there to say, look, it's so easy for all of us to want to look like all of the famous social media stars, when in reality, millions of us are nowhere near that. In fact, millions of us are sort of self-medicating in our current IDGAF states by sort of fantasizing about living vicariously through all these social media stars. My exhortation to you is to cut off that drug, cut off the self-medicating by just scrolling through the feeds of all of your favorite famous social media stars, and sober up a little bit and start to say, hey, I don't want to be living in the aftermath of these effects of poverty any longer. And it's not a quick fix. It's not a Powerball ticket. It's going to be a long, hard, dangerous, diligent road to change your stars. But it is doable. It's doable. So that's what I'd like you to take away today, is that it's doable. It's difficult, and it's going to feel insurmountable And you're going to be tempted to go back to the isolation and the despair and the grumbling and the apathy and the fatalism. Those are always going to be there. But it's possible to break the cycle. It's possible to move away from those things in a very productive, proactive way, um, with a view to the long haul. So turn off the self-medicating of fantasizing about being a Kardashian or being a Kanye or being some other, the Greer brothers or whoever. I mean, there's probably dozens of these people that were self-medicating with wishing we were them. That's going to get you nowhere. It's going to get you nowhere. It is, in fact, going to guarantee that you just continue to cycle in the toilet bowl, never going down. So just go down, let it flush, get in the sewer, and then let's say, hey, you know what? At least I'm out of that cycle of the toilet bowl. I'm going to climb out of the sewer, and I'm going to find a different path forward. So these are the perils of poverty in my estimation and my experience. And as I said in a follow-up special episode of Muthonomics, I'll cover the antitheses, the opposite points, the counterpoints to each one of these five very damaging yet powerful points that I've just covered. So have a great day. Turn off your social media feeds and start to adopt a viewpoint that says, I am capable of changing the effects of this poverty in my life through proactive, long-term, patient outlook. So questions and comments below. Would love to interact and, help people in any way that I can on this front. Have a wonderful day, and we will see you later.